Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The 5 Truths About Work-Life Balance, featuring Jay Ellard of Simple Intentions. We'll get started here in about 60 seconds. I'll give everyone a couple of quick breaths to sit down, get settled in, and at 1:01 on the dot, we will start promptly. Good afternoon for those of you who are just now trickling in. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, The 5 Truths About Work-Life Balance, featuring Jay Ellard of Simple Intentions. Jay, next slide, please. A bit about me. My name is Emily Stringer, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Some background on me: I've been with MBO Partners for just over 7 years. I work as a consultant services advisor here, and I respond to the request of independent contractors who are curious about MBO's service offerings. This is done through consultation appointments, where we learn more about you and your background and your needs and determine if MBO's services are a right fit for you and your business of one. Jay, next slide. MBO's mission statement is to make it easy for independent consultants and their clients to work together. For a high-level overview, we offer a complete, all-inclusive business operating platform for independent consultants. We take care of the administrative items that are typically outsourced to several different vendors, like incorporation, contract review, liability coverage, invoicing, expense review, tax processing, your withholdings and your payroll, and access to tax-efficient portable benefits. Jay, next slide, please. Now for some housekeeping items on today's webinar setup. First and foremost, you can see all of the controls listed here. Secondly, we will be emailing a slide deck and a recorded copy of the entire webinar to all registrants within the next week. Last, we will be taking questions throughout the presentation, and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Any questions that we do not get to will be answered via email after today's presentation. Jay, next slide, please. If you would like to follow along with this presentation on Twitter, use hashtag MBOWeb to submit your questions and comments at MBO Partners. Next slide, please. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Jay Ellard. Jay has spent the last decade teaching thousands of people in over 50 countries the skills of awareness in the workplace. As the founder of Simple Intentions, a conscious content company, and the author of 7 books and over 200 articles on the topic of awareness, she's an expert and thought leader on how to be more present and balanced in all areas of life. The awareness framework was born after Jay collapsed from stress-related adrenal fatigue in 2008. She mashed together complex ideas founded in neuroscience, communications theory, behavioral science, executive coaching, and Eastern philosophy into a simple structure to help people learn and apply the skills of awareness. This framework has been implemented at multinational corporations such as Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Expedia, Pearson Education, and other leading companies. Jay, at this time, I'll turn it over to you for today's interactive presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. As mentioned, my name is Jay Ellard, and I'm an author and expert on work-life balance and awareness as a skill, which is a rather odd thing. As you will soon learn, I don't really believe in work-life balance. And it's a rather strange thing to become an author and expert in. A better way to describe my work is I'm an expert in behaviors we choose that create imbalance, disengagement, and disconnection in our life. So how does one have an expertise in this area? I'd like to tell you a story around how that came to be. to give you some more context before we get into the 5 truths about work-life balance, which is the title of this presentation. My story began on a hot summer night, not in Seattle, Washington, because we don't have many of those there, and that is where my company is based. It was a hot summer night at the Amway Arena in Orlando, Florida, the first time I collapsed from stress and exhaustion as a direct result to the hours I was working and pressure I was under managing media needs for the top executives at Microsoft Corporation for an internal sales event. Now, I said first time, which implies and confirms there was a second time, only the second time it was a few days later, back in Seattle. Only that time there were no paramedics and no humiliating ride in this little golf cart that they put me in at the arena when they drove me past my colleagues and peers. The second time, it was just a trusted vendor, a trusted independent consultant, like many of you on the phone, who picked me up off the floor and drove me back to my house and kind of propped me up against my door. At that point, I decided it was probably a good idea to go see my doctor, my general practitioner. So I went to go see my doctor. My doctors confirmed what the paramedics had guessed in Florida, and that was that my body was experiencing something called adrenal fatigue, which meant my body had too much stress hormone in it. And at that moment, its only choice was to just shut itself down. My doctor's medical advice to me was for me to quit my job. Yeah, really, that was his medical advice to me, that I quit my job. Now, I knew in that moment that was the wrong conversation to be having, but I didn't know what the right conversation was to be having. So I took that guidance and I took a 2-week vacation, if you can call it that, 2-week time off to heal my body and really process what has happened and what my doctor had said to me. And I kept thinking over and over again, like, how in the world did I end up in this position? How did I end up here? I'm a smart woman. I have a master's degree in communication management. The executives at this, giant company trust me to make them look good on these big screens around the world. Like, how did I not see this coming? And I kept thinking about this question, and 2 things occurred to me. The first was, it felt really good. I was getting a very positive payoff for living the life I was living. I felt valuable. I felt successful. I felt needed. I felt as if I had finally arrived, that I was successful, right? I had reached the idea of what success looked like and what I'd been working so hard to achieve. And I was getting a very positive payoff for living the life I was living. So that made sense. The second thing that occurred to me, and the biggest aha moment, was up until that moment in my doctor's office, I realized I had never had a conversation about work-life balance, stress management, or mindfulness in my life with anyone. I'm a 4th-generation entrepreneur, so we weren't sitting around talking about work-life balance or stress management around the dinner table growing up. It wasn't a conversation I had at any point in schooling, either high school, college, graduate school, and it certainly wasn't a conversation that was being had at corporations I was working at before Microsoft and at Microsoft. So it began to make sense how I ended up in that situation, because it didn't occur to me that there might be a different choice or a different way of being. And then I started realizing that I had surrounded myself and I was working with and for many people who were living the exact same life. So it makes sense. I didn't see a different possibility. So this is the point in the story where everyone likes to think, so I quit my job and I wrote a book and I started traveling around the world talking to people about work-life balance. That's so not what happened. What happened was I just went back to work. That's it. I just went back to work. And I became obsessed with this topic, trying to learn as much as I could about how I had ended up in that situation and been surprised by it. I got really deep into the physiology of the body and the neuroscience of the brain, and really wanting to understand how it's possible to reach this breaking point and kind of be surprised by it. I've been practicing yoga for a good decade before this experience, and I got much deeper into my mindfulness studies. I got deeper into meditation, and I started stalking as many leadership experts as I could who would talk to me, who were doing this in a different way, who were appearing to have both balance and success, who were practicing with presence and deeper levels of engagement. And then what happened was, as I started making these small different choices in my life for how I was showing up, I became even more kind of successful in that. The more intentional I became about work and the slower I was working, the more I was speeding up in more the right directions. And then leaders would ask me, they're like, hey, you're the lady that collapsed. Could you come talk to our team? You seem to have figured something out. And it was then that I realized there was such a need to begin to have a different conversation in workplaces about the impact of our behavior and why we're doing what we're doing. It was at that time I eventually left my full-time job as an employee to found my company called Simple Intentions. Now that hot summer night, that collapse was 10 years ago this July, and I started my company 9 years ago. Since then, I've authored 7 books on the topic. I have an 8th book coming out in March. I've had the incredible honor and privilege to speak in over 50 different countries on this topic to companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Expedia, Amazon, Pearson, and many others. And I've had thousands of conversations with people about what work-life balance means and what it doesn't mean. And what I've learned through all these conversations is there are 5 universal themes or 5 universal truths that began to emerge from country to country and company to company. And these I call the 5 truths about work-life balance. And that's what I want to share with you today, are the 5 truths about work-life balance. A few ground rules for how we're going to have this conversation. As you're listening to this content, I want to ask you to hold this guilt-free, judgment-free space. Because many of us have done many of the things that might come up today, and you're gonna go do them again, and that's okay. What we're trying to create is the awareness around our behavior, and when we choose behaviors that support us, and when we choose behaviors that sabotage us. So all we're doing is having a conversation. I want you to stay in this kind of guilt-free, judgment-free place as we delve into this topic. The other thing, as mentioned, is if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the question box, and we'll stop as you have them and address them. I want this to be as interactive as possible. And then there's a poll slide that we have and a couple of interactive questions that I want you to take a couple moments to reflect on a few questions. So those are some ground rules for how we're going to have the conversation. There's no question off limits, so please ask any questions that you have whenever you have them, and we'll get to those. With that, I want to go ahead and jump into the first truth about work-life balance. And the first truth about work-life balance is you can define work-life balance however you want. There are a lot of ways to talk about this concept, but only one way that feels right for you. So go ahead, call it work-life anything. It doesn't matter. You can call it work-life balance, you can call it work-life harmony, you can call it choice, integration, flexibility, blur. Each company has their own way of addressing this and calling this, and as consultants, you might work for different companies that call it different things, and employees react differently to the different words. It doesn't matter. What I've learned over a decade of doing this work is most people share a similar desire, which is to create easy, joy, and meaningful engagement between the interconnected roles, responsibilities, and relationships that make up their life. And there are as many ways as there are people on the planet to describe what living a balanced life looks like. Because each person has their own idea of what is comfortable, tolerable, and acceptable. So there's no right or wrong way to define balance. It is what it is for you and for you alone. So now I want to take a minute and have you reflect on this question. Balance to me is. See, when I work with people most often, they're like, oh my God, I'm so out of balance, I'm so out of balance. And I ask them, well, what does balance mean to you? And they are like, oh my God, I don't know, I just know I don't have it. So part of the equation is defining what balance actually means to you, because then it becomes so much easier to know when you're in it or when you're out of it. So in the chat window, if you could, I would love it if a few of you could just share what balance means to you, if you feel comfortable, or ask a question about this at this point. What does balance mean to you? Any words that come up?
Jay, I just got a good one.
Yeah.
Someone chimed in, a mindful choice to live life and work. Novel idea, right?
Yeah. And to be aware, I like that the mindful choice, the part is being intentional about the choice you're making, because most of you probably on this call as consultants really love what you do, and you've chosen this type of work because you want to create a type of balance in your life that works for you, so you can have the opportunity to be fulfilled professionally and be fulfilled personally. And it's the intentionality of why I'm making the choices I'm making to allow that space to occur, and not being at the effect of, oh my gosh, I've made this choice, what's happening? But to be the one driving the choice and being mindful or intentional about the choices you're making.
Yes, and mindful keeps rolling in, living mindfully in the present moment.
Yeah, mindfully. Mindfully, what does that mean? Like, that's such a big, popular thing right now. You've seen it on the covers of magazines everywhere. There's a lot of conferences and events that talk about mindfulness. And what does mindfulness really mean? Well, there are a lot of skills, there are a lot of elements that make up mindfulness as a whole. And what I specialize in is awareness as a skill, awareness as a business skill. And awareness as a business skill starts with, what does balance mean? What am I intentionally choosing or not choosing? And so when you look at the mindfulness field, if you will, awareness is one skill, compassion is another skill, kindness is another skill, discernment is another skill, and there's all sorts of these being skills that are part of this mindfulness moment. And my belief is that awareness is the cornerstone skill from which all of mindfulness comes from. And it starts with the ability to see the world and how you show up in it, awareness. The ability to see the world and how you show up in it. And that is how we create a mindful life or mindful choices, by our ability to see the world and how we show up in it. And as that applies to balance is, if you don't know what balance is to you, how are you going to know when you're in it? And how are you going to know when you're out of it?
Absolutely. And Jay, another one that we got, living life on my terms to the extent that it does not impact me professionally.
Yes. And that's how, again, the skill of awareness, that's how, when does it impact you? Like, when is that point of impact? Is it a headache? Is it a stomach ache? Is it repeated sleepless nights? Is it muscle aches? So there's a lot of body things, or is it I am working on a toxic team that's not allowing me to produce my best in a creative way because the way the team functions? Like, where is that limit? And if we don't have the skill of awareness to know where that limit is, that's when we start heading down this imbalanced path that leads to disconnection and disengagement. But it's a trick, because it's as simple as seeing it, but then once you see it, then we have to move to action around it. So seeing it is in itself incredibly difficult, and the next step is then to move to action, to put the boundary or the limit around, this is starting to impact me, my productivity, my efficiency, or my happiness.
Yes, and Jay, I think someone just hit the nail on the head with what they chimed in, being calm, confident, positive, and present.
Yes, right? And I almost want to flip it and put present first, because when you're present, that's going to allow you to be calm, confident, and what was the other one? Calm, confident, and present. So when we're present, that's when we're more open to have these other skills come to the forefront. And when we're multitasking or disconnected or distracted, we're only halfway engaging in whatever it is we're doing. And so no wonder we feel out of balance in those times, because how if you're not fully present? Right? Again, linking this all back to this mindfulness movement.
Yes, Jay, I think this is all great advice and great conversation for us to be having before we move on to the second truth.
Yes, let's move on. So the second truth, wait for it, you will be in and out of balance your entire life. Hopefully this will be relief to some of you. This is just the way the world works, right? Not a single one of us is going to change the laws of nature. What goes up must come down, and it's this simple. You're going to be in and out of balance your entire life. Your needs for balance will shift and change as your life changes. Things like new jobs, new relationships, new homes, new roles, new hobbies, births, death, health, your health and others' health, All these things are going to impact your needs for balance. And your needs for balance are going to forever be evolving. You're a dynamic being living in a dynamic world. And your secret power is in recognizing and accepting that dynamism of life. What you need right now in this moment on this call today is very different than what you're going to need 6 months from now, 12 months from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, right? What you need changes. And this is how I like to represent balance. You're going to be in and out of it your entire life. But when you know what it is that you're coming back to, if you think about your equilibrium as what's in between the red lines on this slide, when you know what it is you're coming back to, when life circumstances shift and change around you, the pendulum feels much less dramatic. And so some of you might have roles in finance, some of you might be working on product teams, some of you might be getting married, some of you might have new children or babies in your life. All these things, right, are going to create a little bit of imbalance or disturbance in your equilibrium. And when you know what balance means, you know you can come back to it, and it feels a lot less dramatic those times of the year when you have to put in extra hours, or you're pushing to launch a product, or you're having a big life change like moving, for example. So you start feeling a lot less dramatic when you've started to define what balance feels like for you. And once you've accepted that your needs will change and you know what it is that you need, and then it becomes much easier to have awareness to start making choices that support your needs, and then communicating your needs with the important people in your life. Because you're just going to be in and out of balance your entire life. So acknowledging and accepting accountability for your needs, wants, and values is your shortcut back to finding your center. Which brings us to the third truth about work-life balance. And this is the most complicated, hard truth there is about this topic. Balance has nothing to do with work. Not the type of work you do, the level you are at, the hours you put in, the hours you feel like you should be putting in, or even if the job you have is paid, not paid, like being a student, a volunteer, raising children, running a household. We all have responsibilities that can be considered work, right? Whether you get paid for what you do or not. More than that, balance has nothing to do with your gender, your family structure, your parental status, your religion, your education, your income, or your geographic location. Work-life balance is not about any of these things specifically. It's mostly about the conversations we have or the conversations we are not having about how all of these things, as well as our feelings about these things, how it impacts our lives. Work-life balance has nothing to do with work. Most of the issues we attribute to being out of balance at work or home can be tracked back to and resolved through a conversation. To be specific, an authentic conversation, the kind where you say what you actually really, really mean. And so what gets people stuck and in trouble and keeps us busy and disengaged and disconnected are all the conversations we're not having. The conversations we're not having with our bosses, with our business partners, with our customers, our clients, our friends, our significant others, our children, and most importantly, the conversations we're not having with ourselves. It's possible that 99.9% of the time, these conversations we're not having are about the things, the triggers that are causing the imbalance in our life. And these triggers boil down to, most times, they boil down to your values and the boundaries or lack of boundaries that support and honor your values in all the relationships you are in. The relationship you have with your work, the relationship you have with others in and out of work, and the relationship you have with yourself. So this is where this gets really, really tricky. If it's as simple as having these conversations, why are so many people, millions of people, not having these conversations? The answer is as simple as the question, and in most cases, it boils down to fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being perceived as less than, fear of failing, fear of asking for help, fear of being different, fear of actually being perceived as someone who shows up as being balanced and successful, fear of actually figuring it out. And then, of course, there's also the guilt and the shame that clings to this topic of what if I appear to be balanced? So sometimes these conversations we avoid having about saying no, and our fear boil down to our fear of saying no. So saying no to someone at work or saying no to someone you love might let them down, and no one wants to let anyone down, especially on purpose. And we're even like genetically wired to please the people around us, because as like cave people, we were alive. We stayed alive longer when the people around us were pleased. So this is some really deeply ingrained human behavior where we are wired to keep our tribe happy. So when we know we're going to intentionally disappoint someone, it's physiologically very discomforting in our body. And therefore it becomes much easier to disappoint yourself than someone else. It's so much easier to say no to your own needs than to knowingly disappoint someone. And when you say yes to people, assignments, projects, and roles that are in conflict with your values, or you engage with people who don't support, or even worse, disrespect your values or your boundaries, and when you say yes when you're already at or beyond capacity, what you're doing is you're actually saying no to yourself and creating the exact imbalance in your life that you're working so hard to not have. So, work-life balance really has nothing to do with work. It's about authentically owning and clearly communicating your yeses and your nos to the people you share your life with, which includes yourself. I know that's a pretty big truth for a lot of us to face, and for most people, what I've learned is there's at least, even the most balanced people in the world still have at least one conversation they're not having with someone somewhere. So I'm curious to learn from you in this poll, what's a conversation that you might be needing to have right now? And just to kind of understand where people on this call are and where some of the themes are, because what you might learn is you're not alone in some of the conversations you might need to have. We'll have the poll open.
For all of our participants, we'll give you about 60 seconds to chime in here. So what conversation you need to be having to make your work-life balance possible? Boundaries with people at work or at home, meeting expectations or having certain behaviors, work and non-work hours, support around the house, or roles and clarity on current projects. About 30 more seconds here.
And there's no wrong answer, it's just the answer.
Jay, to learn a little more about our participants here, 50% chimed in and noted that boundaries with people at work or at home are the conversation they should be having. That's very telling. Then we have 20% each at meeting expectations and behaviors, and then work and non-work hours, and then 10% on role clarity on current projects.
Okay, that does not surprise me to see more than around 50% of people struggling with a boundary issue or a conversation around boundaries. this is one of the top 4 blocks that I see when I work with people, whether they have professional corporate jobs or not, is around setting boundaries. Again, because when we set a boundary, we're setting a limit. And we know that when we are setting a boundary, likely we will be disappointing someone in some way. And it might be a small micro disappointment, or it might be a bigger, larger macro disappointment where we're at capacity and we're going to have to miss a deadline because we just have too many priorities and something has to come first. And so one of the easiest ways to help with having conversations around boundaries is to acknowledge in advance before you start the conversation, hey, I'm going to tell you something that you might not necessarily want to hear right now. And just by naming it, most times it allows you to exhale and be able to have the conversation a little bit more authentically, and it allows the other person to kind of prepare and be like, oh, okay, what is it? And 9 times out of 10, what you tell them is nowhere near as bad as what they invented in your head that you were going to say. Because people normally jump to the worst case scenario and they make it be a much bigger thing. You're like, well, I'm gonna tell you something you're not gonna like to hear. We're really running behind on this project and we're not gonna be able to deliver this for another 9 days, and we're doing everything we can, and here's the plan and here's the process, and I know this isn't the news you wanted. Most times that response is gonna be like, oh yeah, that's not at all what I wanted to hear, but thanks for letting me know, and we'll make a contingency plan, and then you can move on and get to the action phase. It's the lack of the conversation that then starts building this kind of pent-up emotional fear or resentment or these missed expectations. And so we start getting a lot of wrong perception building that happens. One of the easiest ways to describe this is if you do say you're going to deliver something and it needs to push, but you don't tell the person that it needs to push until the last minute, all of a sudden you look unreliable when you're not unreliable. You're incredibly reliable. You just wanted to avoid having the difficult conversation around a boundary. So you actually gave off a perception that's not accurate of who you are because of your fear of having an uncomfortable conversation. So it makes sense that boundaries is a difficult thing to talk about. It's the impact of not having the conversation with boundaries that becomes more difficult to deal with in the long run. So it's a question of, are you going to play the short game and have small, uncomfortable conversations and set limits? Or are you going to play the long game and have these relationships that might be potentially damaged because of the impact of the lack of conversations around the limits? Is there anything else that came up in the questions or chat windows around these conversations or boundaries?
Not yet, but I would very much like to encourage our participants to chime in. Oh, we just got one.
Yes?
We just got one. In regard to setting boundaries at work, what is your opinion about toxic culture that prevent or discourage?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and thank you so much for asking it, because many people face this every day in their work teams and their environments. And what I've come to believe and what I've noticed in my work is most of the time these toxic work cultures are habitual patterns and not necessarily anything that each individual on that team wants to be even a part of. But we get caught in this collective think, or these collective behaviors, and this is just how we act at work. And so we walk into a meeting and we're all multitasking in that meeting and no one's paying attention to each other, and then we're disrespecting each other, and then we're angry at each other because we're not paying attention to each other, and it just starts to kind of build on each other. Now, if you would talk to each individual on that team, most likely each one of them is experiencing the same fatigue and the same dissatisfaction with the way the team's running. And this is where the fear comes back into play, where we fear being the first one to say, hey, this is crazy. Can you believe we're treating each other like this? We're all just human beings coming to work wanting to do good and be good. Why are we acting like this? To be the person to interrupt the pattern and set the boundary takes a tremendous amount of courage. And work cultures won't change until we have more people who are willing to take the accountability and have the courage to shift that culture. And that starts one conversation at a time. For example, with meetings where people are multitasking, to be the one person in the room, whether you're the meeting leader or not, and whether you're the consultant or the employee. I've seen this happen both ways. Anyone in the meeting has equal power to say, hey, can we just take a minute and go devices down for a second and try to get clear on what it is we're trying to accomplish? I've seen it time and time again. When someone does that, it's just the whole room, and most people are so grateful that someone's done it because they all want to do it too. And so, though it might feel like a very disempowering place to be when you're part of a toxic team and exposed to a lot of these behaviors, you can start to be the change a little bit more than you think is possible in your own way, in a way that's comfortable. And that's the only way that we can disrupt some of these toxic patterns that we see in corporations, is by just one meeting, one behavior, one-on-one at a time.
Oh, Jay, we just got a comment from one of our participants. FYI, acknowledging the toxicity and negative patterns has unfortunately been known to lead to termination of an employee due to insubordination. Very sad situation.
That's incredibly heartbreaking, and I wish I could say that's not the first time I've heard that or seen that. Now, there's I don't know the situation that's being specifically talked to here. And what I've seen is in those cases, it boils down to the context in which that feedback was given, or the desire to create new behaviors was the approach to having the conversation. So it's easy to fall into a situation where we're blaming the team or the boss or the project or the consultant and move into a conversation that sounds more like criticism instead of a desire to create a new culture. And sometimes when the conversation comes across as criticism, we can be seen as either complaining or not being a team player. And so this is where the skill of communication, and one of my books deals specifically with kind of dealing with the communication part of the how and expressing these difficult conversations, where the approach to how we begin to talk about it at work allows it to be heard in a different way, where it can begin to create a different future. Where at times, if a team is super toxic, it will spit out the most healthy person. This kind of like systems theory modeling is, a team will spit out the most healthy person until it's ready to become healthy. And sometimes that's actually good attrition and good for that person, in that they need to be in a role that's healthier. So I hope that addressed the question in the scenario. It's really about how that message is delivered in an authentic way, where you're owning your part of it as well, and not blaming or criticizing, but really genuinely interested and invested in switching the team culture.
Jay, I think that's wonderful advice and certainly speaks to the situation. So with that said, I think it's time for our fourth truth.
Okay, and the fourth truth is my favorite truth. Not that I'm supposed to have a favorite truth, but this one is my favorite truth here, and I'm sorry, it looks like the slides have stalled there. There we go. So the fourth truth is creating balance is free, which is great news because everybody loves free. So when it comes to creating balance, you don't have to join a gym, hire a professional coach, find a therapist, go get advanced degrees or certifications, join a meditation group, purchase a ton of books, download a whole bunch of, ebooks. These are all options you can choose. So you do not have to do any of them. The only thing you have to do is choose balance as a lifestyle. Seriously, that's it. The only thing you have to do to create balance is to choose it as a lifestyle. Okay, so you decide you want to make the choice, but then what? Okay, so you choose it, and then where do you go? The next step is pay attention more. Seriously, that's the guidance. You choose balance as a lifestyle, and the next step is to start small, pay attention more. Many people don't spend much time where they are when they're there. They're either still thinking about where they have been or where they will be, which robs them of the ability to be where they are when they are there. The richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor have equal access to the currency of presence. And there is no cost whatsoever to being present. It's free to pay attention to your environment and to see and feel as much or as little of the experience as you want. It's free to pay attention to the people, the relationships in your life, to slow down and to really hear what is being said, and to notice what is not being said. And it's free to pay attention to you, your body, your feelings, your wants, your desires, and especially your thoughts. Because here's the thing, odds are, everyone on this call, you already have a pretty great life. And paying more attention might make it feel that much better. Connecting to what you already have is free. It's the disconnection that costs you so dearly. So the magic is creating balance is free, and it can begin right this moment, just by choosing to be more in this moment, just by choosing to close whatever second window you might have open as you're listening to this call, or to put down your pen and stop writing whatever it is that might not be related to this call, or to be fully engaged when you're talking to whoever you're talking to, and look them in the eyes and really connect and be present. All of that is free. And when we start leaning more into this skill of presence, all of a sudden we start feeling a little bit more balanced and a little bit more complete, or a little bit more, having a little bit more equilibrium in every moment that we are in, because we're not focused on what is lacking, but we're focused on what is occurring. Any questions or comments about the skill of presence? Because this is really, again, linked to mindfulness and awareness. And you don't have to quit your job to find balance either. Just have to choose it in each moment. Okay, with that, that brings us to our fifth and final truth. The choice is yours to create balance each day. So it's your choice to define what balance means to you. It's your choice to accept there will be times of greater imbalance. It's your choice to own and authentically express your yeses and your nos. And it's your choice to more deeply connect to the world around you, right? It's your choice to be present. And here's the thing. Some days you might make choices that support your definitions of balance, and other days you're going to make choices that sabotage the type of balance you're seeking. And the magic is that every single day, many times a day actually, you get the choice again and again and again. You get to choose, am I going to disengage, am I disconnect, am I going to connect, or am I going to engage? And another hour later, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, another meeting later, you get the choice again and again and again. And so when it comes to creating the skill of balance or the skill of awareness, it's a constant practice. It's a lifelong skill that you get to work on and build over and over again each day. And sometimes you're going to go to bed and be like, oh my God, that was a horribly out of balance day, and I was out of alignment with my words and what I said, and I didn't have this conversation, or I totally was distracted in that meeting, or I wasn't paying attention to my children when they were talking, whatever it is. And you know what? The next day, you get the choice to try again. And again, and again, and again. So with that, I want to try to land this for those of you who are participating right now, and just have you reflect for a second, what is one action that you might be willing to take to create more balance by the end of today? What is something that came up for you as we were talking in this discussion, or something maybe you wanted to do before this discussion, but maybe feel a little bit more empowered now? In the chat window or in the question window, is there something that you're willing to try to create more balance? Curious to hear what's coming up for you all. And we can also start taking questions at this time too.
Yeah, Jay, we had something come up that I think is very much related to this. And it's one of the things that I think most of us would be willing to give up to an extent. Do you believe that mindfulness in the present is also related to a penchant for multitasking?
Yes, So what's the question specifically? I have some strong feelings on this, so I want to make sure that what's the answer to the question.
Yes, so I think this is more looking at the ratio between a penchant for multitasking versus being able to be mindful and present. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that equation?
Okay, so what's a neuroscience? So I'm going to go to the data first. The neuroscience tells us that the brain doesn't actually have the capacity to multitask. There's no such thing. So from a scientific standpoint, the brain, men or women's brain, cannot multitask. What the brain does is it does something called task swapping, which means we go back and forth between two tasks. So it might feel to us that we're doing them simultaneously, but we're not. We're doing task swapping. And so we can't do two tasks from the same part of our brain at the same time. So I cannot be giving a presentation right now and typing a text. I would be going back and forth, and that would be the task swapping. But I can give this presentation a walk around the room because that's using two different parts of my brain. And so that's an important distinction to have. So I can walk and talk, but I can't talk and type at the same time. Now, on average, it takes between 2 and 7 minutes for people to task swap. So if you're, for example, on a Skype call or a WebEx call, and you are working on an Excel document, and someone calls your name, it will take you between 2 and 7 minutes to jump back into whatever that conversation was on the call, and then to refocus back into the Excel document. And people's brains are a little bit different, and so people who might have more of a meditation practice or a deeper attention practice, they might be able to task swap more on the 2-minute spectrum to go back and forth a little bit more quickly. But the average person is going to take around 5 to 7 minutes to kind of go back and forth. So when you are multitasking, you're actually making those tasks take twice as long. So that's what the science says. And so on the emotional level is, if you are in a room with someone multitasking, for example, I like to use the example of like we're out to dinner and we're on our cell phones, because this is so common. We've all done it before, and we all do it again, and we see people do it all the time. So we're having dinner, and then I'm on my phone. So that could be a form of multitasking. And on the emotional level, what I'm actually doing is saying, you're not important right now. What's on my phone is more important. And so I'm making that person perhaps feel disrespected or not seen or not important. Now, likely they're not going to say that to me, but they're going to carry that feeling with them, and it will eventually begin to erode that relationship where people feel like, wow, when I'm with you, I'm not important because you're on your phone. And so there's an emotional impact to multitasking, as well as kind of that brain science that says we can't do it. For example, if we're in meetings, the same scenario, if we're in meetings and people are not paying attention to the speaker, the presenter, that can be seen as a form of disrespect, or it's disrespectful because you miss half the things the meeting presenter's saying, and then you email them later the same question that they might have covered. So then their perception of you might be like, wow, this person doesn't pay attention. So there's a huge impact on multiple levels with this thing we call multitasking. And I just find it hysterical that most job descriptions have multitasking in the title or in the description, but there's actually really no such thing. What we want to say is we have high ability to prioritize and to be efficient going between tasks. I hope that addresses the question.
I think that very clearly addresses the question, Jay, and I'll tell you why. Someone chimed in and said that they would commit to turn off their phone when needed and not worry about immediately responding to texts and emails. So I think your advice is very well received.
Woohoo! I highly, one of my favorite tips to give people is like, use your airplane feature as much as you can to begin to experiment with going offline a little bit, or putting your phone away, or not even taking it, and just, make it an experiment. See what happens if you do that, or don't plug it into a different place in your house. A lot of people sleep with their phones right by their nightstands, which is fine if you can turn all your apps off so you're not buzzing and chiming and being distracted while you're, in your intimate moments with the people you share your life with. Or plug your phone into the den or the kitchen and see what happens to your quality of sleep and your relationships if you change that around a little bit. So just, experiment with it. Try not to take it so seriously. Just see what happens if you set some of these new boundaries with your devices, and just play. And you might be pleasantly surprised that your level of presence escalates, and that you might feel a little bit more balanced just by setting boundaries with your phone. Any other questions or comments that have come up?
We have someone who is fully committed to starting a trend of single tasking. So I think this is good. This is good.
And the other tip that I want to offer on the single tasking versus multitasking is the skill of awareness. Going back to this, it's the ability to see the world and how you show up in it, which means paying attention to when you're not paying attention. And so if those of you on the call, success for me for this call with you today would be, I've noticed when I'm not paying attention. I notice when I'm multitasking. It doesn't mean that you're going to immediately stop multitasking, but if you can begin to see when you're doing it, then that can eventually lead to action. But we have to be willing to see when we're doing things that sabotage us before we can move to action to start supporting us. So just being able to see it is success, and that might be enough of an action for some people on this call to begin creating a future that's different from the past.
I think that's great advice, Jay, and something we all very much need to hear.
Right? That's the thing that I love about this topic, is it's not rocket science, but it's not exactly simple either. Like simple doesn't always mean easy. And so it's incredibly complex because we're dealing with human behavior change, and that alone is a complicated topic. And I could give you 5 hours just on human behavior change. So I want to do a real quick wrap up here. So the 5 truths about work-life balance is you can define work-life balance however you want. You'll be in and out of balance your entire life. Balance has nothing to do with work, but more about the conversations you're having or not having. Creating balance is free, and the choice is yours to create balance each day. With that, my final takeaway here is the choice is yours. Each day, you get to choose again and again.
So for those of us who are on the line, I think we can all very much thank Jay for a wonderful presentation this afternoon. So insightful, something we all need to hear. I very much recommend that everyone check out Jay on Amazon. She has several books that are available, including The 5 Truths About Work-Life Balance. Check her out on her website, simpleintentions.com. There are online courses. Please feel free to interact. And Jay, with that said, I do have one really quick question to circle back to on the conversations that we should be having. So we have someone who would like to know, how do we overcome ego in others, our own, in order to initiate that conversation? I think ego is what causes the example that you just gave, and I think perhaps referencing about the phone.
Yes. Wow. How much time do we have? Yeah, the ego is that's a big question here. So I go back to the skill of awareness. So in recognizing if we're dealing with our ego or someone else's ego, we want to have the skill of awareness to recognize what is driving the behavior. And we also want to try to stay out of the space of judging, whether we're judging someone for being in their ego or judging ourselves for being in the ego. So first we have to recognize what is motivating the behavior. Like, why am I on my phone right now? Why am I choosing to do what I'm doing? And noticing, is it because it's in alignment with my purpose and how I really want to show up as a human being, or is this motivated by how I want to be perceived in the world? Kind of like the life I was living before I collapsed. I was very motivated by my ego and the payoff I was making those choices and those decisions. So the key is to create awareness around where the behavior might be coming from, and then move accordingly from that. And when most people are living out of the ego, what experience has shown me and what research has led me to believe, a lot of times those behaviors are very fear-based. And so people might feel very insecure, or they're dealing with fear of not being good enough, or fear of being perceived as less than. And so our egos come out a lot bigger to hide some of these more fragile emotions that we carry. So I would say it goes back to the skill of awareness.
And that makes a lot of sense based on what I think we all deep down know about ourselves. So with that said, we will go ahead and get things wrapped up here. And Jay, again, we so appreciate the great advice. This is a wonderful topic, something we all need to be continually aware of in terms of where we are within our own lives and how that interacts with work. So with that said, we are going to throw up a quick poll here to see who would like to learn a little bit more information about Jay, who would like to learn a little bit more information about MBO Partners. And that way, we will reach out to you within the next couple of days if you do request more information. So please select one, and we'll give everybody about 30 seconds here to chime in. All right, and we are out of time. So we will also put up a quick question about who would like more information from MBO Partners, and we'll give everybody about 30 seconds here. And we are out of time on this one. So as I previously mentioned in the presentation, we will be emailing out a slide deck and recorded copy of the webinar within the next 7 days. Please keep an eye on your email for that. In the meantime, please enjoy Jay's content. Reach out to us at MBO Partners, and we would love to hear from you. Jay, thank you so much for taking the time today and educating us on a wonderful topic. And cheers to a little more work-life balance for us all.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. All right, dropping off.